All right, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here. Today we're going to talk about our back supports and kind of give you hopefully what you need to know about them to pick which stealth back support your client may need. Before we dive in here though, I do want to point out a couple of housekeeping things. I'm going to be recording this, and we'll make this recording available on our YouTube page and our website as quickly as we can. Usually within a week or so. And then if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, in the Q&A, and I will try my best to answer those as I go along. All of the slides and recording, and there will be some documents that I mention at the end. I'll make sure to share those when we're done, so just keep a lookout for those. And with that, we'll go ahead and dive in. So today we're looking at choosing back supports, and the best back support is not always going to be, the deepest, the longest, deepest, most rigid, most customized option for the person, right? The correct choice is the one that gives that client enough support to improve their posture and their function without unnecessarily restricting movement, restricting reach, propulsion, breathing, vision, things like that. And so that's the point I'm going to try to make as we go through this and try to keep within that framework. So with that in mind, I'll give you guys a good in-depth look at our back supports we offer at Stealth. The short version here of the objectives is we'll look at some features, some of the options, and tie that to the clinical implications in that decision-making process for selecting a back support. So back support selection should begin with the client, not the catalog, right? We want to assess the client just like we normally would for any other seating and positioning device. So we want to look at the pelvis, check out that pelvic position, assess spinal curvature, trunk strength, balance, check for any asymmetries, and then start to make those decisions about like what level of support do we need? How much shoulder movement do we need? How much scapular movement do we want? We want to see if there's any pressure concerns to be aware of, and then get that good picture of how is that person really going to use this wheelchair day in and day out, right? That presentation really should dictate the amount of support, and then their function and needs should dictate the level of freedom, and the back support kind of falls into all of that, right? So we really want to take that same approach we do for any other seating positioning thing. And that slide should have been deleted, sorry. But at this level, we know that not all backs are created equal. There's variables that actually drive clinical outcomes, right? They're not just a difference in the product, right? So all of the differences here, the reason for all of these is for different clinical reasons. So we have a lot of things we'll go through. We'll talk about shell rigidity here in a minute on certain backs. That's kind of our foundation, right? The more rigid, the better control you get, especially the more involved postural need. But that might come at the expense of weight, where maybe you have some more flexibility needs that you could put in its place. But maybe with that flexible backrest, you start to lose some efficiency in push strokes, for example. Height and width come down to intent to some degree, right? Are we prioritizing that trunk support, or are we preserving some movement and function for that client? Depth, we'll talk about depth off and on. That contour depth is really key for managing that seated posture. Deeper contour is going to stabilize better, but you can overdo it and limit function. I'm going to talk about the top profile, the top shape of the back off and on, right? And so that top profile and scapular clearance can be huge for active clients. If they can't move their shoulders, they've already lost some functionality in their chair, right? If they're self-propelling and can't move their shoulders. Lateral support might be an add-on component for super targeted support, or We have some built-in lateral support capability for just more generic support. So we need to be intentional about what strategy we choose there. And I'm not really going to dive much into that lateral support topic today. I'm going to keep it focused on the back supports. The foam, the cover, that's where pressure, immersion, that microclimate, that's all where that comes into play. So we have a lot of similar but different things to talk about here. So it's just subtle differences, and they are going to make a difference in how it plays over time. So hardware choices as well. We're going to have to talk about some hardware choices because that can make or break the solution. If a client who needs to break down their chair regularly can't easily remove that hardware and get the chair broken down, then we've done them no favors, right? Um, and then all of that's going to have to work together. So the bottom line is all of these things that we typically treat as features, they're more so your clinical tools. So I want to make sure that as I go through these next slides that we kind of view it in that way, in that clinical lens of these being tools, not just features. So with that, I also want to mention size. No, let's get this to work with me. Yeah, size. Um, Size is something that might get oversimplified quite a bit, in our opinion. This is absolutely a clinical decision. It's not just matching the chair width. We all know, especially with stealth back supports, that the listed size on the shelf on that back doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, right? There's a lot of factors that feed into size from the client side, right? Their trunk width, their support height needs, how much freedom you want to give them while they're sitting in that system, how tight you want to make that on them. Then you layer in that contour depth because that's going to change your usable space pretty quickly. So you also have to factor in the chair itself, right? How wide is the canes? How wide between those canes? What's the frame width? What your hardware actually reaches to. So there's a lot of factors when we talk about sizing. We're really talking about how all of those variables come together and either support or limit that client. So to get there, we really want to just start to tie everything together. And measurements are pretty important, right? It's not just about numbers here. Yes, we want that say trunk width, and we need to understand the pelvis, PSIS contact, all that. But that's the starting point, right? We also really want to look at what we're dealing with posturally, what's flexible, what's fixed, how that client's presentation is going to interact with the back. Layer in the function, what's their trunk control, their endurance, how much movement do they need for propulsion or reach. And back height is a good example of that balance, right? If you go pretty low, you get more shoulder freedom. If you go pretty tall, it gives you more stability. But there's always a trade-off, and you have to find that like Goldilocks zone. And then we can't forget about those skin and pressure risk areas. So they should be the thing guiding that material and support decision. So once we understand the client, we have to shift the focus to the chair because the best back in the world, it won't work if it doesn't integrate, right? So just to keep it simple here and start with the basics, what's the actual width of the chair? What are you mounting to, right? A rigid versus folding frame, manual versus power. Those all kind of change our mounting options that we'll talk about later on here in this presentation. Then we need to think about how the chair is being used. Are we going to be in tilt and recline for extended periods and maybe require some support behind the shoulders? Or what about all of those additional secondary supports, right? Head supports, harnesses, laterals, where are all those attaching to? Are they going to be to the chair or to the back? So we need to get that complete picture of how the clients can interact with this, how the backs can interact with the chair, and then recommend the best option from there, right? So a couple of quick things. If we do all that well, we can avoid some of these fairly common hiccups that we still see from time to time. Most of these missteps we see aren't about like lacking information. It's just maybe oversimplifying some of the decisions that are actually very related to each other. So it's very easy to anchor on like one reference point and assume everything else falls into place, but that's usually when picking the right back starts to go sideways. And it's usually the smaller, less obvious factors that start to compound and create issues. So just staying intentional, keep the whole system in view, and don't default to a single variable is kind of key here. So let's finally start talking about the back supports we make and sell here at Stealth. We're going to start with the ADI family. Now, ADI products, they're strong candidates when a client benefits from a lightweight back that provides that trunk support while also preserving mobility. There's a family of backs here that we'll talk about, but the key thing to remember is that the last four here on this slide, they're all basically the same backrest, right? So that ADI 2.0 or QBack 2.0, anything with those 2.0s, they're the same backrest, the overall shape, the sizes, they're all the same. So they offer the same positioning characteristics to the customer, but there's some key differences there that makes them individual different lines, right? So we're going to go through this list real quick, and I'll try to not hang up and get way too in the weeds on anything here. But the ADI Active Posture is our newest addition to the ADI family. It's really meant for clients with that mild presentation. They have mild support needs, and it's intended to really stabilize that trunk, hopefully enhance that upright posture without restricting movement. You have some integrated posterior contour supports, and those can be adjusted in height up to about 2 inches, and then in width as well. So we're talking about a support here that's meant to assist the posture and not really correct it or anything like that. It's something that gives the client a reference point without locking them in, right? This is just enough support and structure to support that upright posture, give them hopefully what they need to preserve endurance, but then allow some natural movement there. So this one really works best when we're trying to guide that posture rather than aggressively correct it. So think of this as that support device or facilitator, right? It supports what that client can already do. For the client-wise, who might it benefit, it's really appropriate for clients who benefit from that posterior support, but still rely heavily on movement, right? So maybe they're self-propelling, they're reaching, they just need to move around for a more functional position or balance. Maybe they have a very mild asymmetry, some slight fatigue, decreased trunk control, but they're still active participants in their mobility, right? The goal isn't to stabilize, it's just improved consistency, some endurance without sacrificing function. And we're not trying to hold them in a correcting position or anything like that. We're just supporting and giving them a solid place to rest with this back. So I'm not expecting anybody to remember this slide. I'm going to go through several sizing slides as we go through. I just want to remind you guys that sizing information is on the webpage for any one of these backs. I'm going to also send you some sizing charts when we wrap this up. But this back is fairly straightforward. You can pick the size that fits the chair you're working with, and then just remember that the space inside that backrest where you would actually fit inside of and sit to is 1.25 inches smaller than that, so it's a little narrower. And it's mostly due to the foam that's in there. Height is just going to match the level of support that the client needs. Oversizing can creep in if we aren't careful, right? Too tall, too wide, and suddenly we start to sacrifice some propulsion, some reach, transfers, stuff like that. So be careful, be intentional, and like I said, we'll provide you guys with some sizing references on all that. Now the ADI 2.0 family, whether it's the AL, the AFT, or the QBAC, or even carbon fiber. We'll kind of talk about them all as one thing here. Um, to boil it down into one statement, they essentially, it gives us a lightweight, mild to moderate contoured solid back support that's really designed to promote that upright posture and even slow the progression of some postural decline. So at a really high level, kind of remembering that the spine is just a stack of vertebrae. They all move semi-independently. They're all stacked on each other, all balanced on that pelvis. And if we don't give that adequate support, especially with something like a sling back, for example, things start to become unstable for certain clients. So these solid backs here, on the other hand, they give you a more consistent surface to support that trunk with, improve that pelvic position, and really just balance everything and provide stability and function for the client. So that's kind of when we select a back, it really comes down to managing that balance between support and freedom here. And why I bring this back up and hang on it for a minute is ADI family, especially the 2.0 family, really highlights that pretty well. So within the ADI 2.0 family, we have both AL and AFT styles. And this is going to be true for anything called ADI 2.0 or QBAC 2.0. So AL or aluminum back it's a back with a curved top. That curved top is meant to allow the shoulders to move. It's really intended for our more independently active users. Maybe they're self-propellers, somebody performing a lot of tasks with their upper extremities, but they're not spending a lot of time in tilt and recline, right? AFT, or aluminum flat top, it has a flat top so that it provides support behind the scapula. It has some added cutouts and slots in there to make mounting harnesses and strapping easier. But the side benefit is that the shape of this, with that flat top, means that the harness, like a shoulder harness, is a lot less likely to slip down the side as easily as it would on an AL or a curved top back. So AFT is really the go-to in the ADI family for somebody who needs that added support more broadly over the whole back. Maybe they're utilizing a chest harness or a strap, and your like really easy example end user here is somebody who has a tilt in space feature on their chair, and they need to have their shoulders supported while they're tilting. So now, getting into some more of the clinically meaningful decisions with these backs, let's talk about how much depth do we actually need. And I want to talk about this as less as which option do I pick, and more along the lines of what problem am I trying to solve for that client. So at a higher level, contour depth really comes down to like competing priorities, right? So if you're constantly balancing this, it's freedom of movement versus that level of support and control. So instead of memorizing numbers here, we want to kind of think of this as being on a continuum. So on your shallower end, you have the active contour. This is really your like most movement-friendly option. It's ideal for users who have fairly reasonable trunk control. They can reposition themselves. Maybe they need to access things. They need movement for function, for propulsion, for reaching, things like that. So that contour is more about guiding that posture rather than enforcing it, right? If you give them just enough shape to cue to midline, you provide light lateral stability, but you're not boxing them in. So you can add thoracic lateral supports if needed. If you really need to get targeted and aggressive, you can add lateral supports to this active contour. But this is where you typically land for your more active user, or those who, again, really rely on that like trunk movement in their day-to-day. When we get into the deep, we're shifting priorities. So this is more for your individual that has some less reliable trunk stability, right? Maybe they have some limited endurance. Posture starts to collapse over time. So we're talking here about a back that isn't just guiding; it's actively starting to assist with some trunk control. You're getting more of that generic lateral support. You get more physical contact surface there with a bit more forgiveness, though, against fatigue and asymmetry. So you're still trying to preserve some of the function. So this is often that middle ground where you're supporting without completely restricting, hopefully. And then on that extra deep side, on the far end, we're maybe prioritizing stability and positioning over movement, right? So this is more for our users with fairly significant trunk instability. They have limited ability to correct their own posture. They're higher risk of collapse or just progressive, you know, asymmetry, just slowly migrating to one side or another. At this point, the back's acting more like a positioning system rather than just a support surface. You've got pretty strong lateral boundaries, a really defined home base for that trunk out of all of that. And so um, we may be trading off movement as we go deeper. So clinically, this is where we really want to pause and ask is how much movement can I afford to take away to gain that stability they need? So again, trying to frame this as less of an active versus deep versus extra deep. Maybe we look at it more as a how much control does this person bring versus how much do they provide? What level of movement do they need for their ADLs? And where are they failing throughout the day now, right? Ultimately, if we go too shallow, they fatigue, collapse, so you lose position. If we go too deep, we risk causing a limitation to function, to comfort, even compliance, right? So the goal, again, that sweet spot for posture, where we're supporting posture but function still preserved. So with ADI, all the ADI 2.0 family is narrower than the frame width. So again, don't try to memorize these specs here. I'll give you some cheat sheets for this, but you'll find that the active series has a usable trunk width or trunk space of about 3.5 inches less than what we call that back. Deep is about 3. Extra deep is only about 2.5 less than. Reason for that difference is there's an outward flare on this shape, so it gets wider as it gets deeper. So when we measure for somebody's trunk, we should keep that differential in mind. That's really the big thing I want you guys to take away from this is the actual side-to-side trunk space on an active is much different than on an extra deep. So I've linked the specification chart here on this slide, so no need to memorize it. I'll also go ahead and share a PDF of that with you guys when we wrap up. But just know there's a 2.5 to 3.5 inch difference here between what that back is named and who it fits. And the biggest reason for that is that it's in between the cane style back. Now, that plays into your hardware. Your hardware here with ADI is really designed to be extremely lightweight and versatile, especially for what it does. You have 3 groups here. Your elite mounts are the lightest mount we have. Both are fixed once you lock them in. If you need the adjustability for that hardware, you might need to move up to the Pro mount, where our Pro mounting hardware is something that kind of bridges the gap between a lot of functionality but still really lightweight. They're a tad bit heavier, but you get more ability to fine-tune width, angle, height, depth, things like that. And then we have a couple of quick release options on the far end there for somebody who needs to take the back apart. We'll touch more on hardware towards the end of this again, but I do want to zoom out for a second and talk about where ADI really fits in clinically. So ADI kind of tends to be the right choice when the problem is defined, but not extreme, right? These are clients who need a solid, consistent posterior surface something more supportive than a sling, but we don't need fully custom or modular approaches to supporting them, right? We're usually dealing with a fairly mild to maybe a moderate posture. One reason ADI gets selected is when that upper extremity function is a priority. If you've heard this a lot already from me today, if the client's propelling, they're reaching, they're transferring, maybe they're managing their drive controls, we can't really afford to over support them. So ADI lets us give them enough structure to improve their posture, but without stealing the movement that they actually need to function. So think of ADI as your go-to when you want a solid, lightweight, efficient back support without over engineering the solution or over restricting that client. Now, we're going to move up to the Tarta Original, and this is a custom back. So the design philosophy here behind Tarta, it was centered on allowing movement where the client needs and support where it's functionally meaningful. So that balance between freedom and control is what could really drive that long-term tolerance and performance, especially in an active user. So flexibility is really the key differentiator here, not flexible as in soft, but flexibility as in selective movement. So being able to decide where this back flexes, where it holds, that lets us accommodate for real human movement. Lets us deal with postural variability, day-to-day changes without constantly chasing adjustments and changes. So instead of choosing between fixed shapes, we're shaping this system around the client, right? Rib by rib, vertebrae by vertebrae. So we also get a lot of potential for growth to build out unique shapes for asymmetry or really fine-tune without starting completely from scratch every time that client changes. So comfort is really the end result out of all of that. It's not really an add-on. So when we do all of this correctly, we can distribute pressure like we need to. This back is incredibly breathable, so we can keep the person cooler and drier. We have room to get in there and feel for pressure checks, check skin, things like that. And all of that's hopefully a really big clinical win for that client. Now, when you strip it all down, Tarta Original isn't really complicated. It's just repetitive. You've essentially got a central spine. You've got ribs coming off that spine and pads touching the client, and that's about it. Those parts just repeat from top to bottom. That central column becomes your primary structure, your control structure there. That's where flexibility, where a lot of the growth, the overall shape kind of stem from. The ribs are where you start making the decision to, where to support, where to clear, where to guide posture without forcing it, things like that. And then different pad shapes exist, so they fit the different areas of the trunk appropriately. And once you get all of that together, you're left with a back support that looks complex, but it's a very straightforward back once you break it down and start looking at it. So Tarta Original was initially designed for say active paras, right? But it made sense for much more than just that population. It's the Tarta Original Custom for a reason here. So when the client doesn't fit cleanly into a standard, width, height, contour, kind of a box, Tarta can be a great problem-solving tool. When those off-the-shelf product just isn't appropriate. Since it is modular and built around that client, we're kind of taking more of an orthotic approach. We're building something unique that can, evolve and grow with that client as their needs change. So when we think clinical value here, we have control over where we support and where we allow movement. We're not committed to a single contour. We're tuning that system segment by segment, really. One of the most interesting features here is vertebra adjustment. Each segment or vertebrae can be rotated a little, which gives us the ability to accommodate a scoliosis or some semi-complex curves. I mean, this image here was for, I think this client shows up later in the presentation. I would call that a fairly complex shaped back. But as this back gets taller, those small adjustments start to compound, and we can really get into accommodation for somewhat significant postural asymmetries. The vertebrae and rib angles are independent of each other, so that really does start to shape that back three-dimensionally, right? You can get the structure first, you can refine how that back touches the body, and ribs can be bent, they can be angled, you can remove them if you don't need it in that area. So again, that orthotic mindset, we place pressure only where the body can tolerate it, and we clear where it can't. Because this system is inherently flexible, users are allowed to move around. We want stability. We can block motion where needed to some degree, like say in the lower trunk to build lumbar support, without locking that whole back. And then growth here is another major benefit, another key consideration as well. So by expanding or contracting that overall central spine, the back height can change over time, right? Sometimes by several centimeters without replacing components. For a growing client or anybody whose posture is evolving, say they get spine corrective surgery, they have scoliosis and they get some rods placed in, they can stay in the same equipment with some relatively minor adjustments to it. An interesting thing about Tarta Original is that it's sized sort of like a t-shirt, and that was done really to emphasize that this needs to be built around the client and not their wheelchair, like basically every other back is, right? So your trunk width is what drops you into the size family, and then the overall height is dependent on how many vertebrae you choose. So straightforward sizing here, it's just more so t-shirt sizing. Now, Tarta can be paired with several hardware options. It can be applied to both rigid and folding chairs. You can choose between a couple fixed and removable options. You have a single point adjustable that attaches to the horizontal rigidizer on the chair, or we have a fixed rigidizer that doesn't adjust. We have removable hardwares that would attach to a folding chair. It'd let you break that chair down. Or we can mount it to a power chair if needed. So there are a lot of options on getting this onto a chair. Now, the TFB, if you just joined us for the webinar we did in April, you know this section pretty well already in theory. But still, TFB backs are designed to provide ease of use, functionality, and most important here, client-specific configurability. So these are custom backs that are configured to meet the individual client's needs. But why choose TFB instead of a conventional back support, right? Similar to Tarta, we often find that a conventional mass-produced back support doesn't fit in a client's needs. It might be because of something as simple as an asymmetric posture. It could be non-standard sizes that client needs. Pediatric clients just might be too small for standard back support system, or the amount of growth that they need might not be something an off-the-shelf back can do. So we have some unique needs for pressure management that could kick us into this category as well. Body shape, so quite a few things can kick you into custom, but custom doesn't always just have to be those extremely complex or involved clients who I think are often like mentally associated with custom if you don't do a whole lot of custom. So TFB comes in three distinct styles: linear, contour, and flex. Each one are really meant for addressing a specific set of needs that are different from each other. So we'll kind of dive into these as if they're three different styles of backs, right? So TFB rectangle and I-style backs, or linear here, There are most planar style of TFB that we offer. They are a lightweight aluminum back. They have very minimal contouring on that outside edge. And these are going to be the most similar to your more traditional plywood-based planar custom backs. They work very well in pediatrics, but we do see utilization across all sizes of clients here. This style does not accommodate the shape of the spine much, but it does accommodate for the use of certain spinal orthotics. It would allow for growth and added support components, which is why we really see it used in pediatrics more often. And it's really good for clients who need a simple, adaptable foundation with room to grow, right? Room to add components. We are best suited for clients whose primary needs are support, growth, and flexibility here, rather than that aggressive contouring or precise accommodation of the spine. So this style works well if you need a planar surface that can interface cleanly with other strategies. The linear back is the most straightforward for fitting. A full width linear back is what we say it is, right? So an 18 wide is 18 wide. They're meant to sit in front of those canes, in front of those upright push handles, and your between the canes is 3 inches narrower than what's stated so that it can be placed between those uprights. Gives you more freedom to adjust the seat depth, the seat to back angle, things like that as needed. TFB contour is really ideal for clients who need a consistent trunk width, or trunk support, I should say, and some ergonomic contours without a lot of demands for adjustability, right? The TFB contour, it has a very similar profile and shape to that of the ADI back support, but there are some key differences. So to start off, the top edge will always have that same general profile. It's always going to have a rounded edge, regardless of the top of the overall height. Where ADI, it gets progressively pointier. You get more and more scapular relief as you get taller, or it has a flat top. At certain heights, lower heights, that top becomes flat because it's meant to go below the scapula. And that's not the case here with the TFB contour. On the deeper side, TFB contour is a more snug fit than ADI. It comes into a tighter angle. TFB contour is really ideal when your evaluation finds that a client benefits most from predefined ergonomic shaping that might provide a very immediate postural support. So the style works best when the client shape is fairly well understood, where we don't see that they're going to have a lot of significant changes in the near future. Now, finding the correct size of TFB contour it can be tricky, especially since we're defining foam thicknesses when we order it, and that foam thickness plays into the overall available trunk width. So we'll go with there's a few methods we can do to find the size of TFB contour that you need, but we'll go with one where we start by checking the size of chair that you fit, and then checking the size chart to figure out where the client fits in that, right? Hardware will play into the back. So fixed and removable hardware kind of makes a difference on what size chair it fits. And then when you look at trunk width, remember it's based off of ADI shapes, but it's smaller. So you want the back, or the trunk width here is going to be about 2 3/4 off the size of the back, and then account for that foam that you've selected as well. So there's a lot of math, right? And there's a whole lot of text on this screen. That's why I'm linking you to the sizing chart, so you don't have to worry about memorizing this whole novel I gave you, and I'll send that sizing chart to you as well. Now, our TFB Flex modification, this is going to create a back support with that enlarged surface of relief for various different spinal postures, mainly kyphosis. You'll see that large spinal relief that allows for that. It also comes in 3 depths: in active, deep, and modular. They're all going to include some form of lateral support for added positioning, and all 3 use some moldable thermoplastic rigidizers in the back inside that cover to help accommodate for some different shapes clients might exhibit. So TFB Flex is really ideal for clients with a fixed or pronounced spinal curve who need relief, accommodation, maybe some infield flexibility. The TFB Flex is really most appropriate when there's a need to accommodate but not correct some of those spinal deformities, right? Again, kyphosis or complex spinal curve. This is the style you would choose when traditional foam builds, when traditionally contoured shells can't really safely or comfortably match that client's anatomy. Now, TFB Flex has a flat center section with the spinal relief and 45-degree bends on the outside edges for 4 or 2.5 inches of depth. And this bend is meant to provide that lateral stability. The support travels pretty far along that lateral edge of the shell. And to get it deep, we add an adjustable extension to get into that 6 inches of depth. So the front edge of that foam should be about the same size as what that back claims to be. So again, another fairly easy rule for this one. The Flex Modular is relatively flat overall. It's a relatively planar back. It has some adjustable contour extensions that add some shape, some adjustable shape to it, and that pushes it out to about 2 inches deep. And these can be adjusted in height and in width to create a customized support for each individual. And they can fit between 4 inches narrower to 1 inch narrower than what the back says it is when you look at it from the standpoint of trunk width. So you can add thoracic lateral supports in a couple different ways to this, to those contour extensions, to the flat section when you need a bit more control. But again, between 1 and 4 inches, and that's because those contour extensions are adjustable. Now, we're making clinical decisions around pressure management, around skin integrity. Material and interface choices become very important in that context, right? Just as important as shape and positioning. So cover selection directly impacts the skin microclimate. That's why we use materials like CoolCore. They actively wick moisture away, distribute heat and moisture. They regulate that evaporation, really keep that skin cooler and drier. Airflow mesh, it can improve that ventilation, but increase the friction forces, and that could elevate some abrasion risks in vulnerable patients. Stealth Tech, same thing. It's going to block moisture penetration, but it doesn't allow for much immersion compared to, say, a CoolCore. So there's a give and take with each one. Foam selection and layering drive that pressure distribution. So materials like Sunmade FRG, they give you that viscoelastic immersion, but also resist moisture penetration, and they maintain performance across temperature ranges a little better than other foams may. Then the ability to layer foams and selectively remove material, like with a kyphosis modification, that's going to give us the ability to offload for high-risk areas, maintain contact where support is needed. But when those standard modifications and shapes of material can't fully match the client, that's where something like this foam in place that I'm showing in the image can really maximize the contact and minimize that peak pressure, right? But it does require some pretty careful execution so we don't create unintended pressure points, right? So ultimately here, once we've picked the style of back, clinical decision making is still needed, right? It's about balancing now that immersion, the microclimate, friction, and load distribution to protect that tissue while we now support them with that shape we've chosen. Now, I do want to chat really quickly about hardware. I've mentioned it a few times as we go through here. But there are some hardware choices that we need to think about. They play into how the client and the chair function together. And at a certain point, it will start to dictate um, if that overall back support system is compatible or not. So the hardware selection should be justified clinically, right? For example, a client with high tone or strong extension patterns, they might require a heavy duty hardware or dynamic hardware of some sort. A client who who transfers frequently, whose chair must be broken down or folded, they require removable hardware. So those hardwares really feed into the performance of that overall chair, right? A solid back with a fixed hardware, it'll be a rigidizer, right? You've got metal going across all the way that at that point. And so if you move to a removable hardware has to have some play and some slop in it so it can be easily removed and installed over like that 5 or so years that it'll be in use. So there's a correlation to weight and adjustability as well. If you want the lightest hardware possible, you have to kind of sacrifice some of the adjustability. Adding in more points or adjustment adds weight, right? That's more material is weight. So when every single ounce counts, you may need to choose a less adjustable option. So there's a lot of clinical reasoning, but between or behind all of the differences in these hardwares. Size is another key variable to consider here, right? Most of our hardwares itself fit the most common round tubing. Some work okay on oval tubing, but the hardware choice also feeds into the overall size of the wheelchair that particular back support is going to fit onto. Um, we've tried to make our hardware as similarly adjustable as possible, but again, if you're going for an incredibly lightweight ADI hardware, you're you're just going to have less adjustment range than say a super adjustable TFB hardware, and that's by design. So the hardware ranges are accounted for in all of those spec charts I'll send out. Now, fixed versus removable. This group probably already knows this slide already. Fixed versus removable hardware. Fixed is going to give you a cleaner, simpler hardware, often lighter weight, but there's also usually fewer moving parts or fewer parts, period, involved on fixed hardware. So there's fewer places that can fail over time. Removable tends to be a bit heavier because there's more parts involved. But you need a removable hardware if you intend to break that chair down to fold it or transport it or store it. So you'll find that fixed and removable hardware options are available for all of our back families. You'll also have 2 and 4-point hardware options. 2-point is lighter, it's simpler, especially when you compare it to a 4-point removable hardware style. It also uses up less space on the chair, so you're only attaching to 2 spots on the chair. So for those really busy chairs, it may leave you the space you need for some other thing, right? But it is inherently less stable than a 4-point hardware, especially in tilt and recline. Some of our ADI hardware is designed in a way so that it provides hopefully the stability of a 4-point hardware, but only uses up 2 points of real estate on that chair. So the next thing I want to quickly mention is getting into power chairs. There's a real need to eliminate hardware here, right? There's a few reasons why. Weight is a big one, especially when we talk about lifting a power chair with a vehicle lift. We can eliminate the weight of the hardware immediately when we directly attach, right? When you add the hardware, you often eat up some of the available seat depth. That hardware it has to go somewhere, and that somewhere usually means depth is lost. So when I think of one of the biggest advantages, though, is if you need this rehab style back on a chair with, say, power recline, If you push that back way out away from the center spine as you go deeper and deeper into recline, things become less and less happy. We'll kind of go extreme here for this examples and say if you're pushed out 5 inches ahead of that center spine, you're still 5 inches ahead of that in a full recline in the most horizontal position. So picture a nearly flat seat and back that are laid out in full recline, and lift that back 5 inches up in the air, and that's what you get when you do that. So that difference also does odd things to the performance of that shear reduction action while you're moving through recline. So the ability to drop this straight onto the center spine is really key for not only seat depth, maybe you shave a pound or two in not having hardware, but really the performance of that pressure relieving tool in recline, right? We also have a few power chair adapter interfaces that are, for what they are, pretty lightweight. They are incredibly adjustable. So when you need adjustability but are also going on power, those make a great option as well. Now, a few things to wrap it up here. At Stealth, our ADI family is a great choice for let me back it up to start from the top here. Selecting a back support should not just be about what product of it is available, what's on single invoice, right? It's all a clinical decision. Now, our ADI family, there we go, is a great choice for a lightweight supportive contour that gives you the ability to move around in your chair, in your back, and be active. Where Tarta is a good option if your clients may need to change over time, right? You have non-traditional trunk shapes you might need to support, or you're just expecting that client to grow. And then TFB is your go-to for client-specific materials, shapes, sizes, really when support needs are super defined. Now, hardware, the last thing we just talked about, is a choice that's really going to affect those outcomes. If we choose a hardware that doesn't work well with what we need that back to do, if it blocks what that back is meant for, what's the point, right? So I'll be sharing several references with you. Most of these are the sizing charts that I mentioned off and on. Again, rather than remembering all of that info, just know you have those references available. And then I also have a decision tree that I'm going to share with you guys. It tries to help take all of the information that's in this webinar, condense it down into one sheet, and help you guys make an informed decision on what Stealth back support may be best for an individual. So with that, before I open up for questions, I again will be sending out a PDF copy of this presentation to everybody that joined us. It'll go to the email that you used to register, and then that'll have a link to a quiz. So if you do want a CEC certificate, go ahead and take that quiz. There's also another link for just a general survey about the experience. And then we'll make the recording available on our YouTube page and our website as soon as possible, usually within a week or so. And with that, if there's any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, in the Q&A. We'll get them answered. If not, though, I do appreciate everybody's time. And be sure to join us next month for looking at driving a chair with your eyes.